Let's talk about the form of arguments. So let's take a look at a pretty simple argument. Two premises and a conclusion again. So if the Klingons are invading Sector 9, then the galaxy is at war. The galaxy is not at war, therefore the Klingons are not invading Sector 9. So notice in this simple argument, we've underlined all of the critical logical terms, the logical operators in the sentence. So the if then phrase, the not, the negation phrase, and the therefore are underlined. Now, when we in this case we have a valid argument, um, and we say that it's valid insofar as we're not going to be able to accept the premises without accepting the conclusion on pain of contradiction. So the validity, as we've seen, is dependent then on these little words, these little connector words that are underlined. And those little words, those operators, give the form of an argument, or those are like the scaffolding of the argument. So if we replace the statements, the propositions about Klingon invasions and Sector 9 and the Galactic War and all the rest, but we kept the connector word. So if we kept the logical form and replaced the propositional component, the content, with different contents, as long as we were consistently replacing it throughout, then we would also have another valid argument. So if we, once again, the key to logical form are these logical operator terms like if, then, not, therefore, or, and, if and only if, and a few others that we'll talk about later. But those are the, as we said, the scaffolding of these kinds of form. Let's look at another one. So if you love someone, then they're to be set free. They're not to be set free, therefore it's not the case that you love somebody. So notice that this is the same logical structure as the argument about the Klingons invading Sector 9. And notice too, again, just to emphasize that the validity of the inference depends entirely on the logical form of the argument, not the content. So the logical form is determined by the connectors, and if we strip it down even further, then we have the schema as presented. If A then B, not B, so not A. And that's a valid piece of reasoning. This happens to be an example of what we'll see more of later. It's called modus tollens, is this pattern of inference, and it works, it's valid. So take a look at that. Okay, so another example of valid reasoning. Here we're going to say, well, all persons are mortal, Lulu is a person, therefore Lulu is mortal. And this is another sort of formal structure or formal framework, pattern, etc. that into which you can plug any content as long as you're consistent. Then it's going to be a valid inference. Yeah, notice that this is the first time we've introduced the quantifiers all and some into our discussion. So all and some, as we'll see later, have a very nice set of logical properties. We'll see some of that at the end. So there are some obvious cases of invalid reasoning. We've discussed many of them already in the course so far. So let's look at two cases. So let's look at the first one. So all evildoers hate Governor Fancy Perm. Murphy hates Governor Fancy Perm. Therefore, Murphy is an evildoer. Okay, so can you see the problem with that? I presume it's straightforward enough to right? So just because all evildoers hate Governor Fancy Perm, and Murphy shares that property of hating the governor with the evildoers, right? So both Murphy and the evildoers hate the governor. Doesn't mean that Murphy's an evildoer any more than the fact that, let's say, all all taxidermists are human. Sam is a human. Then Sam is a taxidermist. Taxidermist. That would clearly not follow. Okay, so let's and common sense can sort of show you that there's a problem there. Alternatively, all gang members have tattoos. Max has a tattoo. Therefore, Max is a gang member. Well, he needn't be a gang member to have a tattoo, even if all gang members have tattoos. So he could be a basketball player or a philosophy professor and have a tattoo and not be a gang member, even though all gang members have tattoos, let's say. I'm sure that's not true, but assuming for the sake of argument it is true, it still wouldn't be the case that we can conclude that Max is a gang member. Again, we can rely on common sense to tell us that there's problems with arguments like this, but it's not always so clear. This is why we start formalizing. So consider the following fallacious argument. We've encountered this once before in the course. If ethicists could always be trusted, then one would not need to study moral philosophy, but they cannot be trusted, so one must study moral philosophy. The conclusion of the argument is that you must study moral philosophy. The argument is based on the premises that, ethicists can't be trusted, and if they could be trusted, then you wouldn't need to study moral philosophy. And intuitively, there's something right about that. You might think, common sense tells you, yeah, well, you can't trust ethicists, so you should study moral philosophy. The problem, though, becomes clear once we begin to examine the formal structure of the argument. And then we'll see that it's obviously a bad argument. So let's sketch it out, and here what we're doing is we've sketched the structure of the argument. So we have an if-then operator, we have the if-then here. So if ethicists could always be trusted, then one wouldn't need to study moral philosophy. And you see the if-then is doing the formal work here. This is the little phrase that holds together the formal structure. But they cannot be trusted. The not here is negation. This is also part of the formal structure. And then the so here is working as a therefore, right? So it marks the conclusion. So one must study moral philosophy. So this is the sketch, the initial sketch of the structure of the argument. It might still not be entirely clear to you what the formal problem is, so we can go a step further. What we'll do is we'll try to eliminate our worry about the content or our concern with the content, and we're going to turn this little piece of content here, ethicists could always be trusted, into a variable. We can represent it with a variable p. So we're not going to worry here about the content. We're going to say that we'll just stop thinking about the content for a second. We'll just call it p, and we'll maintain p consistently as representing this little piece of the proposition. This proposition, this statement about the way the world is. Ethicists can be trusted, or ethicists can always be trusted. We'll call that P. We'll do something similar below with one doesn't need to study moral philosophy with Q. And so what we're left with then is the if P, then Q, but not, here's the negation, P. They can't be trusted. And then the conclusion, therefore, or so, not Q. Not Q here, the negation of Q. So Q, notice this is sort of funny here because Q contains a negation. So the negation of a negation is one must study moral philosophy. So the negation was one would not need to study moral philosophy. And so when we say not Q here, we're saying one would not need to study moral philosophy, which is the same as saying one must study moral philosophy. So you might want to pause that and take a look at that if you have some concerns for yourself. Okay, so more formally still, now we're extracting the if-then, the P and the Q, and we end up with something like this. If P then Q, for this, all of this mess here, not P for here, therefore not Q. Okay, so that's how we're going to do the formal, that's how the formal part works. Whoops, there you go. You want to pause and examine that for yourself for a second. Okay, so this is a case, this ends up being our friend, the fallacy of denying the antecedent. We know that that's an invalid, that's a fallacy, it's a bad argument. We studied that in the previous section of the course when we discussed fallacies. It was an example of our formal fallacy. And here we can see that, now once we formalize it, we can see that this is an instance of the fallacy of denying the antecedent. And what you could do here is, if you want to pause the video, is examine another more intuitive example of why it's fallacious to deny the antecedent, and take a look at that for yourself. Okay, so later on we're going to talk in the next couple of modules about counterexamples and validity more specifically. We're going to talk about entailment as well. Here's a valid argument. If P then Q, P therefore Q. This is known as the rule of inference that's being employed here is called modus ponens, a valid piece of reasoning. One of the marks of validity is that there are no counterexamples, meaning this Q has to follow or must follow. There's no way that not Q could follow from these two premises. And we'll try to study, we will study the relevance of counterexamples in arguments later on. But basically at this point, if there are no possible counterexamples to an argument, we know that the argument is valid.